welcome everybody to our 97th Running Online Sport Economics Century, getting close to the century, Sports Economics Seminar. It's great to have one of our most regular speakers in the series, Stefan Szymanski, speaking again, and it's always a pleasure to have him. Before he does start, just a couple of notices. I put a few dates in the reminder email sent out earlier on, but perhaps the main one is that if you want more Stefan, and who doesn't, Stefan is the keynote for the 9th Math Sport International Conference, taking place in person in Reading in just a few weeks' time, July the 11th to the 13th. You can sign up, register, and come along, and I will put a link in to enable you to do that, should you want to, and should you be able to gain access to the UK, given the state of chaos with flights into and out of the UK at the moment. And also, yeah, no, actually, that's the main notice for now, and I'm not going to hold up Stefan any longer. Stefan is going to present on the title is Explicit versus Implicit Incentives in Professional Football. If you want to look at the paper, I've posted the paper in the chat window as well. But Stefan, all yours.
Okay, let me issue number 1. Oh, I'm sharing the wrong screen. Oops. Oh, dear.
Review the results. There we go.
There. Is that right? So I changed my title as well. So
okay.
So apologies for that. But it's the same paper, I should say. Are football players rewarded for luck? A surprise test.
Just to say, Stefan, you've got the presenter view up rather than the full screen for us.
Oh, well now. Already disaster. Oh, what a catastrophe.
If you unshare and then just share the PowerPoint window, that might. But maybe you know your computer better than me.
Okay, let me do that. Yeah.
Yep, that's perfect.
That's what. All right. Okay. Now let me start. So yeah. So I just wanted to make an initial observation that I thought this engram was kind of cute. Shows the frequency of appearance of words in a huge corpus database of books, showing the frequency of the word economics and the word incentives. And in some sense, I think it's an argument to say that economics has become all about incentives in really since the 1960s. And in particular, the idea, and you see this, very commonly in texts like economics, and people often say economics is all about incentives. And so what I want to look at here today is thinking about incentives in relation to football and team performance in general. And I think it's a reasonable starting point to say that team performance in sport will depend on the ability of the players, the effort that the players put in, and luck. And I've drawn here a couple of pictures, or showed a couple of pictures of a very famous player with very high ability, who is obviously paid a very, very high salary as well. But the issue is, to what extent is the contracts of players like Ronaldo being conditioned on their output and the effort that they provide to the team? And the point of the picture is to say, well, Ronaldo is obviously a very highly skilled player, but much as one might giggle at his looking at inspecting his blood wounds on his phone to see how pretty they are, nonetheless, it takes a certain amount of commitment to actually put your head in a position where you can get a wound like that. So commitment and effort and incentives are clearly an issue in professional sports like football. So one of the reasons for the revision of my title was that I came across this paper by Bertrand and Nathan, and from 2001, which has the title "Are CEOs Rewarded for Luck?" To which they conclude, yes, they are. And then they also ask the question, well, should they be rewarded for luck? To which the answer is, it really depends on the kind of luck that you're thinking about. So principal agent theory suggests that in the presence of unobservable effort, then you can't condition contracts, an efficient contract, on effort, but you can condition a contract on the output, which is a noisy signal of the effort that the worker is providing, which is presumed by assumption unobservable. But the point they're making in their paper is that there are some forms of noise which are observable but completely uncorrelated with effort. And their example is an oil price shock for oil industry executives. So however great an oil industry executive is, it's really implausible to think that they can control the oil price. The oil price is subject to random shocks, and therefore any incentive, and these random shocks to the oil price are observable. So the pay contracts of the executives should not be dependent on the oil price. They should filter out the random variations in the oil price, and they provide evidence to show that they're not being filtered out, that the pay of CEOs is contingent on oil price shocks, and they argue that this undermines the claim of efficiency for executive contracts, and suggests rather more the level of executive pay has rather more to do with capture of the firms by the management rather than the efficient provision of incentives. And so what I'm going to do today bears some relation to this, although it's also slightly different. So the first thing I want to do is talk about I'm going to talk about luck as well, and I'm going to talk about luck in a specific way, which is called surprise. And the term surprise, many people here have probably seen several of the papers. The concept, I think, first came from Stadman in 2006, and was developed by Van Oors and Twiel in a paper in 2015. And the idea of surprise is that there is an expectation in advance of any games of a number of points that a team will win from that game. And that expectation can be measured from the bookmaker odds. And the expectation, you can then derive a value of the expected number of points based on the bookmaker odds, and then the surprise associated with the outcome of a game is the difference between the actual number of points won and the expected number of points based on the bookmaker odds. And indeed, you can then go on to see over a season the cumulative surprise, to see how surprise builds up over a season, to see in some sense how much luck a team had, or at least how much surprise a team had in terms of its results over a season. So just on the right-hand side, I've given an example from the first game of last season when Brentford played at home to Arsenal. Apologies to any Arsenal fans. Brentford surprisingly won the game 2-0. We can calculate from the bookmakers' odds, the decimal odds of the bookmakers, what the expected number of points were. And you can see there from the calculation that the Brentford was expected to get just under 1 point from the game. And so therefore the surprise points were just over 2, the difference between the 3 points they got and the expected number of points, just under 1. And so that's going to be the measure of luck that we're going to look at in this. So let me go back to the principal agent theory and flesh that out a little more. So the theory really draws a contrast between two cases, the full information case and the asymmetric unobservable effort case. So in the full information case, it's still the case that output is a function of effort and luck, But if the principal can observe the effort of the agent, then a profit maximizing contract will be what's called the forcing contract. And the forcing contract simply says, I wish you to provide the following level of effort. We think of it as a football player. The team says, we want you to provide the following level of effort in the game. If you don't provide this level of effort, we're not going to pay you at all. If you provide this level of effort, we will provide you with a payment which meets your reservation utility. So that's a constraint that is on the principal, and otherwise, given that constraint, the wage will maximize the profits of the agent, of the principal, and this will be what's called a first best contract, completely optimal. So the asymmetric information introduces an additional constraint into the problem. So now the principal faces the constraint known as incentive compatibility. Incentive compatibility means that when effort is unobservable, we have to assume that the agent will choose a level of effort which maximizes their utility, regardless of what the principal happens to want. Because it's unobservable, there's no possibility of the principal conditioning the reward directly on the effort level of the agent. So the agent must be presumed to choose what's best for them. And typically that will give a result known as the second best. And second best results typically involve lower output, lower wages, lower profits. So in other words, the asymmetric information introduces inefficiencies relative to the first best. That's the cost of, if you like, of unobservable effort. So I'm going to give you a simple example here for thinking about how we would apply this in the context of the football matches. Now, there's a paper which James has posted in the chat. So if you want to see the full model, you can see it there. But this is a very simple adaptation where the output is a function of the output X is a function of effort, ability, and luck. And I've adopted a specific functional form for this, which says that the probability of a win depends on the level on increasing contributions in ability and effort. And so the more ability and the more effort supplied, the greater the probability of a win. For the slides, I've just given a 2 outcome example. So the outcome is win or lose. But in the paper, I use the 3 outcome possibility: win, draw, or lose.
Sorry to disturb you, Stefan. It's not about the paper at all. I just want to mention that I cannot see the chat, so I cannot see the paper.
Oh, James?
I can email you, Sabo.
That will be nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Single
Sorry,
trail
and I will. Anybody else, you can also email me if you can't get it on the chat. And I'll support the paper. And so I need to parameterize the problem to generate some simple solutions. So I have a potentially risk-averse agent whose utility depends positively on the wage paid and negatively on the effort that they supply. And here's the derivation of the forcing contract. And really the only things to notice here, other than to notice that I have actually gone through the formal process, so I'm not making this up as I go along. The optimal, you can see equation 7 defines the optimal effort level of the agent. And subject to that optimal effort level, there is a fixed wage payment W star. So this is the contract. You get W star if you provide E star effort. Otherwise, you get nothing. That's the classic forcing. Here now is with unobservable effort, we have now a second best contract problem. And there's a famous paper by Holmstrom and Milgram which shows that in the solutions to these problems can under some fairly general assumptions be characterized by optimal solutions can be characterized by linear contracts, and that's what I've highlighted in red at the top there. A linear contract which says that the wage is some fixed value alpha, some fixed payment alpha plus beta times the performance measure. So here, the probability of winning. So the agent is going to be paid on this linear contract, which involves an incentive based on the output of the agent. And there you can see equation 9 is the incentive compatibility constraint, which, as I said, has to be added to the problem. And so there, equation 10 is the effort levels to be supplied by the agent. And one thing to note about it, a very simple point, that the effort of the agent is lower now than they will be in the forcing contract. And the difference is the difference between 1, the denominator on the right, the numerator on the right-hand side of 10, and beta, the numerator on the right-hand side of 10. Sorry, the numerator on the right-hand side of the forcing contract equation. And once, so there's a E double star will, unless beta is equal to 1, E double star will be lower. Sorry, whoops. My cat just walked across the screen and that caused that to happen. Okay, so what we can then do is, what the question then is, what are the values of alpha and beta? What's the fixed payment and what's the incentive payment in this contract? And you can see that can be derived from the solution to equations 11 and 12, which are a bit complicated. There's no explicit solution that I can derive for that, but I can give you a numerical example just to show, and this I think is helpful in seeing what we're talking about. So I've made some assumptions there about reservation utility, the cost of effort parameter, and the utility function. And then you can see below, I've written down some results, the optimal effort. So the first column is the forcing contract, the second column is the incentive contract. And so you can see that the optimal effort is lower in the incentive contract. The win probability of the team is lower in the incentive contract. The owner's profit is lower in the incentive contract. The expected wage is lower in the in the incentive contract. So everything's worse in the second best world, which is what we should expect. And then we have a fixed component, which is the entire wage in the forcing contract. And we have a fixed component and a piece rate for the incentive contract. So the piece rate depends on the outcome of the game. So you get in this example, you get a fixed wage of 0.064 and then a piece rate of 5.56 times the result. And so given this, and here we've only got 2 outcomes, win or lose. So there's if you have in the lower table, you can see what is the positive surprise if there's a win. Well, given the probability of given the win probability to start off with, we can identify the surprise either under a forcing contract or under incentive contract. And because the win probability is lower in the incentive contract, the surprise is actually larger if you win. And then the key thing is the surprise pay. The surprise pay in this will be equal to beta times the value of the surprise. And so that's a positive payment. So wages will go up under the incentive contract, but obviously not in the forcing contract. Wages are unaffected in the forcing contract because there's just a fixed wage. Likewise, you can see underneath that the consequences of a negative surprise. So again, the negative surprise is smaller in the incentive contract because the team is less likely to win. But the surprise, and for the forcing contract, there is no surprise pay. But in the incentive contract, the surprise pay is equal to beta times the surprise. And so we can see there at the very bottom, the wage, if you win or lose, it's the same under the forcing contract. But you can see here, there's a big difference. There's the wage is much larger if the team wins rather than if it loses. So that's a numerical example to show you how surprises enter into the pay of the players under incentive contracts and under forcing contracts. Now, it's worth mentioning at this stage that there are some fairly significant criticisms of the optimal contracting literature. And one of those is that really there is no need for these explicit incentives. Implicit incentives are quite enough to ensure performance of in the employment relationship. So if individuals have career concerns, and you would think that football players would be a good example of career concerns, then you would imagine that it's not nearly as important to provide performance incentives explicitly through pay. There is another line of argument known as gift exchange, associated with Akerlof, which says that in any case, employment relationships really are governed rather more by norms than they are by strict incentive rules, such as described with the paid performance contracts, and that in fact excessive dependence on these contract terms will actually undermine long-term relationships. And just again, as an aside, I want to mention something else. Some people who are if you're familiar with this principal agent literature, you might have been wriggling in your seat and saying, hang on a minute here, what about Holmstrom 1982? After all, the title of Holmstrom's paper in 1982 was Moral Hazard in Teams. So you might say, well, hang on, shouldn't you be looking at this paper rather than the standard principal agent contracts that you've been looking at? And so in this paper, Holmstrom, what he does is look at sharing rules when there are many agents. And what he shows in this paper is that an optimal contract will use any signal about employee performance that is informative about their output and informative about their inputs. So that one of the key suggestions that emerges from that is that in an employment situation, compensation could optimally be based on relative performance of employees in the firm. If you're looking at the research outputs of professors and trying to decide whether they're really trying hard, then you could look at the research output of other professors in the same department and use that as a benchmark for establishing relative performance and use compensation to be based on that. However, that might sound like it's particularly relevant in this case, but I would argue that it's actually utterly inappropriate for sports teams. So this is, in my view, a really, really bad idea. I think there's quite a lot of literature that makes this point as well, because using relative performance incentives of players within the same team is likely to seriously undermine team cohesion. What you want is everyone in the team to be focused on the same goal, which presumably is winning. And if you don't, and if you create incentive schemes which are focused on relative performance, then winning may become a secondary consideration. And indeed, there is a danger that players start to use sabotage of their teammates in order to increase their wage. So, as I say, I think there's a literature on this, but also I think it's just intuitively inappropriate in this situation. So before going on to look at the test that I'm going to apply, the surprise test, it's useful just to look at what's in a player contract. So here is the remuneration clause in an English Premier League player contract. And what's striking about this is how remarkably simple it is. So it specifies paragraph 8.1, a basic wage, which can vary depending on the time, on the date. So typically these payments might be staggered, but notice that it doesn't say contingent on performance. It's just there's a schedule of potentially increasing rates depending on the length of time you've been with the club. Paragraph 8.2 says that there should be the player may be entitled to bonus and incentives as part of the club's bonuses and incentive schemes, which has to be set out and annexed as a copy to the contract. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, but the thing to notice here that this is based on the club's bonus and incentive scheme, which not all clubs have, some do, some don't. And then paragraph 8.3 outlines any other payments, and there literally is just that one line for those payments, which suggests that there is not a detailed incentive contract being written in on that line. Although obviously, in practice, these contracts, the precise details of these contracts are generally secret, and so we don't actually know what's in them. Having said that, there are quite a few people out there who say they do know what's in them, and possibly the best description was in the book Done Deal by Daniel Gee, and he talks about different kinds of bonus schemes that players that are offered by clubs. And so here, actually, some of these look pretty much like performance-related incentives. So there's appearance bonuses, win bonuses, goal bonuses, assist bonuses, clean sheet bonuses, club competition victories. There's potentially, he says, payments which reduce your wage if the team is relegated. And then he talks about the squad bonus pool, and that was what was mentioned in paragraph 8.2 of the EPL contract. So what will tend to happen is that there will be a bonus pool allocated by the team, which may depend on the overall league position of the team in the season. And then members of the squad will gain access to that bonus dependent on the number of times they appear in the game. So it's often apparently an appearance related. The chapter does not explain how frequent these are, how these differ between clubs, how the actual size of any of these bonuses. So most of the information here is pretty vague, and you will see things mentioned in the press about bonuses. There was a weird story in the Daily Mail last year about if Manchester City won the treble, then the club would be paying out 150 million or so pounds in bonuses, but the source of that information is kind of unclear, and the details of the contracts underlying that is sort of unknown. So let me now introduce the data that I'm going to use to test for the presence of incentive pay performance contracts in English football. So I'm going to look at the top two divisions, the English Premier League and the Championship, over the last 20 years, or from 2000 to 2020. And the data I'm going to use for this is the wage data from the audited financial statements of the clubs, which people familiar with my research know that I use this for kind of all the time. And this is wage data that actually refers to the entire, all employees of the club, not just the players. But UEFA has done some research on this, and they say that player wages are typically between about 78% and 84% of the total wage bill of clubs in Europe. So essentially, the wage bill covers pretty much all of the wages. The wage bill of the players accounts for pretty much all of the wages paid out by the team. Not all of it, but most of it. So I'm going to use the total wage payment of the club and look at that relation to team performance measures, points, primarily I'm going to focus on, but I will look at some other performance measures as well. And I'm going to look at the relationship between points and wages and surprise. And the surprise is going to be calculated. So this is the Interwetten bookmaker odds for all of the games played in these two leagues since 2000. And I'm going to add in some further controls. So looking at, I have some data on team performance in other competitions and some of the aggregate player characteristics. So before showing you some regressions, let me give you a nice example. Perhaps this is not surprising, but the biggest surprise in the entire data set, the highest number of surprise points for an entire season were the surprise points of Leicester City in 2015-16, when they surprisingly won the English Premier League. And what I'm showing you here is the relationship between points, expected points, surprise points, and wages for the season before they won the title and the season in which they won the title. So if you look at the column for 2000, sorry. If you look at the column for 2014-15, you can see that in fact the expected number of points for Leicester City was actually fairly similar to the actual number of points they won. So they were expected to win 43, and they actually won 41. So they were off by 2 points, and for that season they had a wage bill of £57.4 million. So in the season they won the Premier League, their points went up from 41 to 81, but their expected points were only 53. So there was actually an increase in expected points in that season, but it was only a 23% increase. Whereas they had this whopping number of 28, so basically 1/3 of all their points were surprise points. So what happened to the wages of Leicester City? So again, the wages as reported in the audited financial statements of the club increased from 57.4 million to 80.4 million. So the change was 40%. So that change is much more in line with the expected points rather than the surprise points. Not only that, but if you look below, I've cut and paste from Transfermarkt the transfer fee record in that season. Leicester actually went out on a spending spree that season, and they spent a lot more on transfers than they actually received in income for players that they sold. And the most famous player they went out and bought that season was N'Golo Kante, who played a significant role in winning the title in the second half of the season. So one thing you can see is that relative to 2014-15, the wage bill would have gone up anyway, given there was this influx of players and very little outflow of players in terms of, or certainly measured by the value of those players in the transfer market. So presumably a large fraction of that 40% increase in wages would actually have been paid even if there had been 0 surprise points. So my point here is that just looking at this example of Leicester City, you can see you can get the sense of my argument, which is that it's expected points that matter and not the surprise points. And it's worth making another point at this stage about wages. So one of the benefits of looking at wages from audited financial statements for football clubs is that the financial statements are compiled on what accountants call an accruals basis. So what that means is that when the wages as reported in the financial statements will reflect all payments due to the players as a result of their employment in that financial year. So you can imagine, for example, that the year end of, I can't remember the year end of Leicester City, it's probably June 30th. Most of the clubs have a year end in June or July. A few have a year end in May. So at the end of the financial year ends just after the football season ends. But you can imagine that there might be some bonus payments due to players of Leicester City based on their performance in the 2015-16 financial year, which would only get paid in the following financial year, 2016-17. Well, because the accounts are compiled on an accruals basis, even if those payments have not been made, they should be reported in the 2015-16 financial statement. So in that sense, and likewise, there should be no leftover bonuses from the previous season included in the 2015-16 financial statements. So in this particular case, looking at wages from financial statements has a particular advantage for isolating wage payments which are accrued in a particular season. So here is here is a set of correlations which looks at the relationship between the correlation between the wages in the Premier League and the English Football League Championship, and well, if I just talk about points, expected points, and surprise first, and then talk about the transfer market in a moment. So you can see there, if you look at the row, the second row down for points, you can see that there's a correlation between points and wages, but then you go to the next line and the correlation between expected points and wages, and it's much higher. So it rises, the correlation rises from roughly 0.26 to 0.56 in the Premier League, and from 0.11 to 0.32 in the Football League Championship. Now look at the bottom row and the correlation between surprise and wages, and the correlation between surprise and wages is very, very small. So there's a very limited correlation between the overall surprise and the wages paid out. So let me say something about the transfer market value, and this relates to an issue that you might think about when thinking about surprise and expected points. So expected points, remember, expected points are going to be the difference between the actual points won and the points expected based, the surprise is the difference between the expected, the actual points won and the expected points based on the bookmaker odds, right? So one thing you might worry about is that the expected points measure is in fact biased from the point of view of calculating the effect of incentives, because the bookmaker odds are continually being adjusted during the season in the light of new information. And so expected points at any point in the season may reflect that new information, which then may actually imply that there's entailed surprises that have accrued since the season began, in which case expected points will contain some surprises, in which case just regressing it on the surprise measure itself will give a biased, an underestimate of the value of surprise. So what I did for that was to take the transfer market values of the squads in for each team, going back to the July before the season started. So Transfermarkt provides estimates of that squad values, and those squad values are updated on approximately every 2 months. And those values go back, not for my entire database, but go back to about 2010. So it covers about half the data in my sample. And one of the things that's incredibly striking about that is that the Transfermarkt value pre-season is incredibly highly correlated with the wages that are paid out in each league. So a full year before we learn what the wages actually were, in fact, more than a year before we learn what the wages actually were, we have an estimate of the value of those wages, which is essentially the Transfermarkt value. And you can see here that the expected, we can use that then to derive expected points based on the Transfermarkt values. So in other words, we look at we use the Transfermarkt values, run an ordered logit regression of outcomes on the relative Transfermarkt values and derive the expected number of points based on those. So the Transfermarkt values are really substituting for bookmakers' odds, and you can see there that the expected points based on Transfermarkt are actually more closely correlated with the wages than are the expected points themselves. So here's a first set of regressions which uses the each individual game estimates the wage as a function of, so it's a wage regression, regressing wage on expected points and the surprise in each game. So Now, obviously, the wages here are the end of season wages, so the wages are not varying within teams. So this is basically measuring between teams the sensitivity to expected points and surprise. And what you can see here is that in columns 1 and 2, you can see that the expected points are highly significant. Column 1 is the expected points based on the betting odds. Column 2 is the expected points based on the transfer mark value. But what I've highlighted in red is the effect of the surprise, and the surprise is negligible in size and statistically insignificant. So this would, even if this were economically, if we consider these to be economically significant, they would add tiny amounts of money to the remuneration of the players based on these estimates. Columns 3 and 4 estimate a slightly different version of the model. There are fixed effects are included for each club, and then the surprise is interacted with the fixed effects. So essentially, that's a test about whether individual clubs might have policies, remuneration policies, which reward, which are rewarding surprises rather than looking just at the aggregate level. And so, and what I haven't reported here those interactions, but essentially across all of these regressions, and these cover about there are about 50 clubs appearing in each division over the sample period. Out of all of those interaction effects, only one is statistically significant. All the rest are statistically insignificant. And the sign of those coefficients, about half of them are positive and half of them are negative. So it seems like those interaction effects are centered around 0, while the surprise at the aggregate level remains statistically insignificant and economically tiny. So when we look at this on, this is for the English Premier League on a game-by-game basis. If we look at the English Football League, we get similar sets of results, except that the columns 1 or 2, the surprise now does appear to be significant. But when we add in the fixed effects and interaction terms, the significance of the surprise goes away. Even if the surprise, even if we take columns 1 or 2, the economic size of the surprises is tiny and contributes very little to the overall remuneration of the players. So based on, when we look at this on a game-by-game level, we find that players are not being rewarded for surprise. So now I look at this at a season level. So what I now do is look at expected points accumulated over an entire season and the impact of surprise on the seasonal level. So column 1 includes expected points and surprise with no controls, whatever. And what you get is that surprise is statistically significant, but it's negative. It's the wrong sign. Once column 2, we add in fixed effects, it becomes insignificant. And columns 3, 4, and 5 add more controls to the regression, and the surprise remains insignificant. Notice that the expected points remain significant and the coefficients remain relatively stable as we add all these other controls into the regression. Column 5 breaks down the surprise into what is, roughly speaking, monthly periods. So over a number of games in the season, there's 5 games interval, except at the end of the season where it's a slightly longer interval. And what you can see, one thing you might have thought would be, well, surprise might not be significant later in the season once you know once you get to learn about the ability of the players, but maybe it's important at the beginning of the season, maybe in those early couple of months surprises play a significant role, to which the answer is no. There is the coefficients for the Premier League are negative, so they're the wrong sign, and they're statistically insignificant. And there is one surprise coefficient that ends up to be significant at the 5% level, but overall it suggests that these surprises are, when we disaggregate the surprises, they're not playing a very big role in the remuneration of the players. So now here is the same thing looking at the English Football League Championship. And here we get perhaps a surprising result. Shouldn't have said that. But the result here is contrary to the prediction of the pay performance contract. In theory, now the pay seems to be negatively related to surprises, and that's it's a strange result in the sense that this is implying that when the team does worse than expected, wages go up, and when the team does better than expected, wages go down. So that's not quite the same as we might think of that as being providing some kind of insurance, but it's not clear why it's not quite the same as insurance as rewarding poor performance or underperformance. And penalizing overperformance. So it certainly seems, however one wants to interpret this, it certainly seems inconsistent with the idea that the players are being rewarded under incentive contracts based on their output. So just as a check here, I've used alternative performance measures to see whether using alternative performance measures, the surprise becomes significant. So the first two columns, the first are points and expected points, but then I've looked in column 3 includes the league rank, where teams are ranked from position 1 to 20 in the Premier League and 21 to 44 in the Championship. Then column 4 looks at goal difference, column 5 looks at goals for, and column 6 looks at goals against. All of these performance measures are strongly significant in the wage regression. So these are all wage regressions. So that suggests that pay is being positively influenced by these performance measures. But the surprise is either insignificant or the wrong sign in every case. So again, it doesn't appear that players are being paid for surprises. So that brings us to the question, why then does it appear that why is there no surprise in player pay? So here are 4 possible explanations, I think, which one could use. So one, I think which is, I think is the most obvious, is that effort is observable. So, and people who are familiar with my, certainly my presentations or presence at conferences will know that this is something I bang on about all the time. There is a literature suggesting that the key to the principal agent literature in this case is that output-based contracts are largely desirable in situations where effort is unobservable. If effort is observable, you offer a forcing contract. And really, the version of a forcing contract in football is likely to be, it's not going to be that you won't get paid, it's that you'll be dropped. If you're not trying, you don't get to play in the next game. So one way of thinking about this is that effort is observable. And of course, I mean, there are relatively few players, and football clubs have relatively large staffs. And one of the points that the principal agent literature makes over and again is that if you can monitor performance, that can be better. You can write a better contract, which can condition on the inputs, the efforts of the players, rather than conditioning on writing second best contracts based on outputs. So clubs have large staffs that are constantly observing a relatively small number of players. And also, of course, we also have observability on the part of fans who watch games week in, week out, and provide an awful lot of monitoring for free. So monitoring is expensive. Clubs do a lot of expensive monitoring, but unlike almost every other employment situation, clubs benefit from a staggering level of monitoring information that is provided for free. So the simplest and I think most direct explanation is that teams are not writing pay performance incentive contracts for players simply because effort is observable and rewards are being conditioned on observable effort. A second explanation that is just as good, I think, is that maybe effort is unobservable. But even if it is, there are plenty of forms of motivation that players have in order to perform. So psychologists talk at length about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is what comes within you. It's not driven by any particular external reward, whereas extrinsic motivations are driven by external considerations and of which performance pay might be one. And psychologists tend to think that people are largely driven by intrinsic motivations, and there's pretty large literature which supports in broad terms that claim, although increasingly psychologists have come somewhat grudgingly admitted that there may be some extrinsic motivations may play a role in some cases. But players certainly, we normally think of professional athletes as falling into a class of individuals with pretty strong intrinsic motivation. If you can get to the level of being a professional athlete and being paid to do it, you have stood out from possibly millions and millions of people worldwide. And you have to have pretty extraordinary levels of talent, but you'd also think that there would have to be a pretty high level of motivation. Even if you discount intrinsic motivation, there's the concept of career concerns, which presumably are really, really important to players. So I mentioned the idea of getting benched if you're thought to be under supplying effort. Well, getting benched is really bad for your career because it means that your outside employment opportunities are likely to diminish as you become known as someone who doesn't supply full effort. There are all sorts of career concerns that players have, concerns about how their appearance levels in the team that they're playing for, the prospects for getting appearances in future contracts, the prospects for becoming a manager once you retire as a player, the prospects for becoming a pundit or a commentator on the TV. All of these are likely to be connected with your success as a player and therefore to provide you with significant incentives to provide effort, regardless of what financial incentives are being directly implied in your contract. So there's a strong argument, I think, to say that even if effort were unobservable, that there are plenty of factors which will motivate players without introducing significant pay performance contracts. Now, I think those first two arguments do it really for me, but there may be skeptics in the room, I don't know. So a third argument here would be that league points are not the focus of incentives pay. I mentioned that there were other factors which other performance measures outside of league points that I considered that I included in the regression. So here here are the regression results for the performance in Champions League competitions, the FA Cup competitions, and whether the team is relegated or promoted, relegated from the Premier League, promoted from the Championship, or relegated from the Championship. And the thing to notice here is that all of the cup competition variables are all insignificant, apart from reaching the FA Cup final in column 5 of the English Football League Championship. But by and large, this data, I would say, suggests that cup there are incentive pay related to performance in cup competitions is playing a negligible role in the pay of the players. Remember, again, this is a wage regression, so this is the wages are largely independent of performance in these competitions. However, what is very striking is that the relegation coefficients are large and significant, relegation from the Premier League at least, and then promotion from the Championship to the Premier League is large, positive and significant. While being relegated from the Football League Championship, that's actually statistically insignificant, although it is the right sign. So one of the things to say is this incentive pay? And we know that there are possible terms in the contract about getting relegated, or is this risk sharing? And I would argue that this is really about risk sharing rather than incentive pay. So why would there be risk sharing? Well, the drop moving from the Championship to the moving from the Premier League to the Championship is vast. So the average revenues in the Premier League are about £250 million. The average revenues in the Championship are about £33 million. Pretty much the thing you lose when you go from the Premier League to the Championship is £100 million in more or less guaranteed broadcast revenues. That's a pretty significant drop. And what clubs do is write into the contracts, as we mentioned earlier, that players can be wages can be reduced if teams are relegated, but also players have it written into their contracts that they can leave. And what relegated teams want is for their star players to leave because they can't afford to keep the wages. They don't need the star players necessarily in the Championship anyway, because the level of competition is lower, but they certainly can't afford to retain those players. So what's happening here, and likewise, so when a team is promoted, they're likely to go out on a spending spree and hire new players to be able to compete in the Premier League. So in other words, I think these coefficients are not so much about incentives as about risk sharing and adaptation to the level of competition. And I think that's why being relegated for the Football League Championship, those coefficients are statistically insignificant. One reason might be is that it really is not so important because the revenue drop from the Championship to League One is not nearly as great as the revenue drop from the Premier League to the Championship. So my argument here would be then on point 3 is that it's not other forms of performance, I think, the teams are not providing incentives for other forms of on-the-field performance, which leads to point 4, which is incentives are about long-term commitment, not about game-level performance. And that might be true. So certainly one of the things that's striking about the incentive contracts of players, or what's mentioned at least when people talk about these contracts, is the significance of appearance bonuses. So being able to appear regularly seems to be a key factor in terms of, or it seems to be one of the main forms of bonuses that teams operate. And of course, there is a literature about this which suggests that there's an observation that as players approach the end of their contract, they often tend to appear on the injured list less frequently, whereas once the contract is renewed, they appear on the injured list more frequently. And this is often taken as evidence of the use of incentive, of the moral hazard problem. So if that were the case, then you would assume that the teams would be trying to solve that incentive problem by using incentive pay. So if we observe that that problem exists, then that would suggest that they're not using incentive pay. I have to say I'm kind of fairly skeptical about the whole argument that players tend to, as the pejorative use of the term in literature is shirk once they obtain a new contract. So, as I say, the obvious thing is if that were really true, then teams could write contracts to deal with that incentive problem. Secondly, the data is actually consistent with an alternative interpretation, which is players coming towards the end of their contract are trying too hard. They're not going on the injured list because they know that that might cost them a contract. So they're actually oversupplying effort, which will reduce their career length and actually might harm the long-term interests of the team that hires them as well. Whereas once they've renewed their contract, they go back to reporting injured when they really are injured, which is in the long term is a good thing for the team because the players have the opportunity to recover. So I'm skeptical about that argument, but the evidence here does not really support it anyway, and there's not really there's no real. I'll just say I'm skeptical about that argument. So that brings me to my 60-minute mark. So for once, I've actually seemed to have managed my time reasonably well. So the conclusion of all this is that players the fact is that we know that there are performance-based incentives written into some of their contracts, but this paper is really saying they're not having any effect. The economics literature generally suggests that these types of contracts are used when efforts are unobservable, and the implication of those contracts that is which is being exploited in this paper is that this will entail rewarding players for noise as well as for effort, because when effort is unobservable, you cannot distinguish effort from noise. So if you reward output, you reward noise as well as rewarding effort. That's the logic behind using surprise as a measure of noise, and the results show that the surprise, the noise term, is actually insignificant or the wrong sign in pretty much all of the cases, which implies that teams are not actually writing output-based contracts to any significant degree. So these contracts are not providing effort incentives to a significant degree, at least insofar as winning league games is concerned. And I propose two really likely explanations for this. One is that the inputs are actually observable, so there's really no need for an output contract. And the other is that even if effort is unobservable, career concerns and intrinsic motivation are likely to be more than enough to provide adequate incentives, and explicit incentives would be just redundant. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Perfect timing and lots of time for questions and comments. If you have any, please raise your hands. Alex.
So thank you, Stefan, for your presentation. I like this game-by-game analysis, as you know. Okay, so I have a question there about, can you show, I don't remember whether you used in all of the specifications this fixed effects model, because not game by game, in some cases you used fixed effects and in some cases you didn't.
Oh, sorry, no. So I should say, as I add these variables, so hang on. So the game by game, your preferred. So I should say to everybody, the game by game suggestion is Alex's. So I presented this in Mulder on looking at the seasonal model, and Alex said, no, you should really do it on a game by game basis. So I said, so since Alex knows what he's talking about, I thought, all right, I'll do it Alex's way. So that's why I did this. So here on the game by game basis, columns 1 and 2 are Those are the regret. That's the entire. Those are all the regressives. There's nothing else in the regression. Columns 3 and 4 have fixed effects with interactions between the surprise and the fixed effects. When we go to the season level data, columns 2 to 5 onwards all include fixed effects. So you can see here there's club and season fixed effects in every.
Oh, okay, and I go back to the this game by game thing. So with these fixed effects over a long period of time, I really don't know what is the advantage of using this compared to overfitting the model. Maybe that's one, because we can see that without fixed effects, the result is significant. Surprise. No, sorry, I missed something. Oh, it's not significant, right? It's never significant, but there was something significant.
So the point, Alex, here is that this is surprise across all teams, right? And so you might say that some teams have performance-based contracts, but others don't. And that's where the fixed effects allow me to include an interaction term, which says it's perfectly reasonable to think that a club over a 20-year period would have a policy relating to incentives. So even though the players come and go and the managers come and go, the team owners may actually have, or the team management culture may involve some kind of policy. And when we look at the transfer mark values, that actually just covers 10 years. So it's certainly plausible that over a 10-year period, you could have a standard policy within a club. So effectively, it allows me to test whether we can identify club-specific incentive policies.
So probably I missed it because I thought that in this game by game there was also something significant. There was
only for the
yeah, that's the one. Yeah, exactly. And here is the question. So I'm not sure really why adding these fixed effects here, because there is so much information in betting odds for each game. So you kind of you use it like 2 times. And I'm not sure that fixed effects by itself over a large period of time really contribute something except for increasing standard errors, because you have information over like many years, right? So what is really constant over, I don't know, even Manchester United over like such a long period? Why do you add it?
Well, because Manchester United could have a policy over a very long period of time. That's my argument.
Okay.
You don't like it, but
maybe without. And just another question: this 0.0107.
Yeah.
What does it say? What can I understand? Like, what is the size of the effect?
I think so. Basically, think about this. So you know, the expected number of points in a game is about 1.3 on average, right? The expected amount of surprise is about is roughly 0. This says that the expected points, you multiply this by 1.3, this coefficient here, and that's giving you the impact on wages. Think about this in relation to the surprise coefficient. It's what? It's 50 times larger. So that this surprise element is adding very little, whereas expected points, which are very large, is explaining almost everything. So an important point, you know, one way to think about this is that, so another way to think about this is, again, people familiar with this argument that I've made for many, many years, is that if the pay performance relationship in the wage performance relationship in football is a reliable tells us that wages are a reliable indicator of team quality, which is a reliable indicator of team performance, because the market for players works and people know exactly what they're getting. Well, this is one argument against that. The logic of that is, well, no, it's not. So in some sense, I'm arguing wages ultimately end up causing performance because wages are a proxy for ability. And the argument is, well, no, maybe causation is running the other direction because of incentive pay. So if people are being paid for surprises, then it's not that wages directly wages are proxying ability. Wages may be proxying things like luck. And what this analysis is saying, well, no, that's not really the case. The luck is not playing any role. The best predictor of a team's performance is its is the ability of the team as measured by the preseason transfer mark value. So in some sense, we know which is roughly the same thing as expected points. So we know how teams are going to perform on average. And as far as luck is concerned, that's not having an effect on what the players are being paid. Again, think about the Leicester City example. The players didn't appear to get any extra wages in the season they won, despite the fact that it was a huge surprise. They weren't getting rewarded for that miraculous achievement. They were just getting the wages that they were paid because they were paid on a standard employment contract, which had very little incentive component.
Okay, thank you, Alex. More questions and comments? Dennis.
And not at all convinced, as you probably would expect from me listening to you, Stefan. But I'm having a hard time understanding the relationship, maybe because I don't really understand your surprise variable and performance on a game-by-game basis. What are you thinking is the surprise aspect of a player's performance, of their compensation, if I'm understanding right, that varies from game to game? And I don't know football at all, so I'm going to put it in an American context. Incentives are based on season performance, and how you can take that season performance where you might say there's surprise in how many home runs did the batter hit or how many touchdowns did the quarterback throw, and you're surprised because they threw more than you expected or they threw less than you expected. I don't know how you're translating that into a game-by-game variable in this data to translate into the individual outcome of the match. I think I'm a little more convinced about the season aspect of it, but I'm still a little skeptical of that surprise variable.
Okay, so it'll take a while to persuade you, I expect. I spent 20 years trying to persuade people of this, and this is as far as I've got. So one thing to say is, if you don't like the game-by-game version, focus on the season-long game version. I mean, Alex hates the season-long game version, and just so he focuses on the game-by-game. So that's one answer, which is, I suppose, a bit flippant. But a more serious answer is, all the game-by-game analysis is saying is that every time there's a positive surprise, you should expect to see that correlated with wages. Every time there's a negative surprise, you should expect to see that correlates with the wages, if you believe the principal agent theory. Remember, this is not based on, these results are not coming out of, I'm not saying, oh, let's assume that this is true. I'm saying, based on a theoretical model, which is founded on the logic of incentive pay, which economists almost universally apply, This is the logical implication. The surprises should be correlated with wages if there is incentive pay. If players are being paid by results, principal agent theory says that you should be paid basically for luck, just like exactly the way that Bertrand and Mulanathan said that CEOs should be paid for luck if we follow the incentive theory. It's not, I'm not dragging this out of thin air. This is the fundamental implication of the theory.
I accept that aspect of it. It's what the question is for me is your operationalization of luck in this surprise variable and how that correlates with game outcomes. So think of it in a much more practical way. In the NFL, we can look exactly at the contract that says, here's what the incentives are. So it says, if you do this, you will get a bonus. If you do the next thing, you will get a bonus. And it's hard for me to connect that very specific, obvious pay for performance. I don't know how you could possibly not get pay for performance out of that. And I would think that there's similar things in football. So does the player's contract say if you appear in so many matches that you get a bonus? If you score so many goals, you get a bonus.
Well, so it's one thing to write something into a contract. It's another thing to say that that's actually what you get paid. So if you believe that the entire remuneration scheme is captured in exactly what is written in the contract and nothing else, then if there are incentive elements, then yes, you could do a mathematical calculation. I don't believe that's how contracts actually work in the real world. I think what happens is that contracts are often guidelines, and then what you find is that exceptions are made and differences are applied. Even if you take the literalist version of the contract, even if you say that's literally the only things that get rewarded, it's quite easy to think of ways in which you would not get performance-related effects when you run the regression. So one reason might be, for example, you say to Tom Brady, we're going to give you $5 for every completion you make. That's an incentive contract. It would add more for every, I mean, no doubt there would be, that would add to his salary, but it's negligible. It's just not going to feature as a significant element of his contract. Or it could say, you could say, we'll give you a bonus, Tom, of $5 million if you manage 10 completions in a season. So you can have very underpowered incentives in this, which are really, and where you've already saying, well, Tom, if you're not injured, you're gonna get the money. So, but if you're injured, you won't get it. So that there are lots of ways in which the what's written into the contract, which of course we don't know. We don't actually have the data on all of the incentive contracts for football players. But if we did know them, even that would not necessarily tell you that there was incentive pay. If there's incentive pay, the logic of the principal agent literature says you should be paid for surprises. And that is a very clear and straightforward implication. And the fact that you're not tells you something about the nature of the incentive contracts. It might be that there are very low powered incentives. It might be that the incentive payments are very small for this, but it might be that the contracts are not being adhered to. There might be all sorts of reasons. But the fact is that pay is not varying with luck. And that contradicts the logic of performance pay in the principal agent literature.
I'll just say one last thing and then I'll stop. What you're saying reminds me very much of previous collective bargaining agreements in the NFL where they were very explicit about incentives likely to be met and incentives unlikely to be met. And so it's like this distinction that you're saying it could be something that's almost that you're guaranteed to meet this, and is it really incentive pay versus here's this thing that nobody thinks you're ever going to achieve, and then you did. And I think in a way what you're trying to do is find out if implicitly or something inside those football contracts, there is a distinction between incentives that everybody thinks you're going to achieve and incentives that nobody thinks you're going to achieve. And then periodically people do achieve them.
Okay, that might be true, Dennis, but what I would like you to take away from this is that what I am claiming here is an explicit test of principal agent theory as applied to football, nothing else. So, and what I would what I want to die in a ditch for is this or isn't this a test of principal agent theory, not whatever. I mean, because I believe this is what economics does. We have theories and we test theories. This is a test of a theory. You can say it's a bad test. You can say it's badly conceived, or there's maybe a fault in the test. But that's what I want you to take away, that this is an explicit test of principal agent theory as applied to football. So.
Thanks, Dennis. We've also got a question from Richard.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. So I had a couple of thoughts to add to your likely explanations, which I wondered what your view was on them. One is when comparisons are made with principal agent theory in a corporate environment, they're typically thinking about CEO pay, which is often linked to share prices and so on. And the decision that the CEO makes in those circumstances is a considered one. They think about the consequences of what's going to happen and the pros and cons and so on before making the decision. In the sporting context, if you think about, you gave the example of Cristiano Ronaldo at the beginning. If you think about the decisions that he makes, he's making split-second decisions, absolutely instantaneous, instinctive decisions. And I would wager that one of your explanations is that he's not responding to a contract drawn up by lawyers and agents. He's responding to purely football instincts, and therefore the contract isn't effective in the moment. Now, he may take a longer term view when he sits back in the shower afterwards and thinks, I should have banged in 2 more goals today. But at the moment, unlike a CEO, he makes an instinctive decision, and that may dissipate some of the effect and explain your results. My second point is, I think that there's also an element of power relations that needs to come into this between players and clubs. And I have asked a number of owners of football clubs why they don't put clauses in players' contracts for relegation, to cut their wages in the event of relegation. And I know Daniel Gee said this was one of the things that does go into contracts, but I can tell you unanimously from the ones that I've spoken to, and it's been about a dozen, that they say, well, the reason we don't, and the reason we don't, is because the sort of players who we need simply wouldn't accept that. The power relations are such that we can't impose those sorts of conditions on the players that we want. So there is an asymmetric relationship in the power structure, and that would also, I think, be an explanation of your finding. So I just wondered what you thought about those 2 points.
Thank you, Richard. I think they're both excellent points, and I should probably make it more explicit in the paper that I consider those, because I think they are both really important points. So I think your point about the first one about not responding to incentives at the moment, I think that's critical, and I think that's why I mentioned the Holmstrom moral hazard in teams argument about relative pay. One of the things that would be absolutely catastrophic would be if Ronaldo was stopping to think about his incentives in the middle of a game. That would be appalling. And the way that people often talk about this is in relation to sabotage. If I had a relative performance pay contract, I certainly wouldn't pass to somebody who could score the obvious goal. I'd go for goal myself. And that is seemingly a big enough problem as it is in football without actually adding in the negative effects of performance of incentive contracts. But I think you make a broader point there, which I think is important, which is anything that makes the player stop to think when they're playing is a really bad idea. You want them. Football in particular, I think, relies on a good deal of instinct in play, or repeated behavior and muscle memory and so forth. And again, you don't want people figuring out contract incentives whilst they're behaving. I think the second point, I think, is also a really good point. I think interesting. I'd emphasize that a bit more at a presentation I gave at Rotterdam, organized by Thomas. And one of the arguments that an IO theorist made to me there was to say, well, hang on a minute here. If these contracts are, if it's optimal to write these things into a contract, then it shouldn't interfere with with the highest ability players. So there's a sort of standard result in the optimal contracting theory literature that inefficiencies creep in as you go down the ability distribution. So in other words, you write the efficient contract for the people at the top of the ability distribution, but that necessarily there are inefficiencies introduced lower down. So in other words, you choose the contract that gets the best out of your best employee, and then you have to make do with poor performance from lower employees. Right? You can imagine if you did it the other way around, that would not be good. You'd be losing out because you really want the best employees to do the best. So I think I agree with what you say, and I have a lot of sympathy, and my instinct is the same as yours. I think this is right, but I slightly give it pause because of some of the results in the optimal contracting literature, which suggests that shouldn't be a problem at the top end of the distribution.
Great, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Stefan. We are hitting up against the time limit. Stefan and I have another meeting to go to quite soon that we can't miss. So I'm going to spend a moment and say thank you very much, Stefan, for another very interesting talk. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to that. We will return next Friday on the 1st of July with Ruud Koning of the University of Groningen, who's going to be presenting on determinants of a country's Paralympic success. So until then, wish you all well and have a great weekend and see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.